It was precisely 6:15 on a frigid Monday morning in February when Vickie Sterling stopped me dead in my tracks, arms outstretched as though she were a traffic cop in the middle of rush hour. In that instant, I realized my tranquil life in Willowbrook Estates was about to come to a sudden and dramatic end. In her perfectly manicured hands, she gripped a violation notice that was thick enough to be a doctoral dissertation. Her eyes sparkled with the kind of predatory glee you'd expect from someone who had just unearthed buried treasure in their backyard. What I didn't see coming at that moment, standing there in my rumpled clothes, utterly spent, was that 3 months later, this same woman would be in handcuffs at this very spot while the officers on the scene laughed like they were front row at a comedy show. But before we get to that truly satisfying moment of well-earned comeuppance, drop a comment below to let me know where you're watching from. I'm honestly curious to see how far this wild HOA saga has traveled across the internet. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss what happens next. It's so outrageous. Nobody could have made it up. I had just returned from what felt like the longest 10 days of my entire life, spent at my mother's side in Grady Memorial Hospital after a massive stroke turned our world upside down in an instant. The last thing I expected upon coming back to what I believed was the safe haven of my own neighborhood was a welcoming comitia, especially one that showed up armed with official-looking paperwork and, unbelievably, a professional photographer. Yes, you heard me right. Vickie actually brought a photographer to document this absurd early morning encounter, as if she were gathering evidence for a high-profile criminal case rather than harassing a neighbor who'd just spent days at his mother's ICU bedside. She thrust the violation notice through my car window with the flair of a stage performer. It cited something called an unauthorized extended absence without notification, a brand new rule, apparently, that was conveniently passed while I was holding my mother's hand and praying she'd survive. I would later discover this wasn't coincidental at all. It was part of Vickie Sterling's increasingly draconian approach to neighborhood management. "Mr. Harrington," she declared with a pompous authority that only someone who's appointed themselves Queen of Suburban America could muster, "you have willfully violated Section 12.4.4 of our newly updated and strictly enforced community standards. Any absence longer than 7 days requires written notification to the HOA board at least 48 hours in advance. This requirement," she paused for effect, clearly savoring the drama of the moment, "a non-negotiable," she continued with chilling composure. "Since you've blatantly disregarded these procedures, you are now subject to immediate penalties and what we call enhanced monitoring of your future activities." The photographer's camera clicked away relentlessly as Vickie set up her expensive laptop on the street like it was her personal mobile command center, churning out more paperwork with intimidating efficiency. What made the entire scene so surreal and ironically comical was the fact that I, Elliot Harrington, make my living as a governance consultant for non-profit groups across the Southeast. I spend my days helping communities resolve disputes and untangle dysfunctional administrative processes. In other words, I know whole law better than most board members know their own rules, and I've seen every trick in the book from people who love to wield their tiny bits of power. But there I was, at 6:15 in the morning, completely exhausted from hospital duty and sick with worry over my mom's recovery. So I decided to take the high road and avoid turning this into a full-scale neighborhood showdown. "I understand your position, Mrs. Sterling," I said calmly, accepting the violation notice without a hint of protest. "I didn't think to inform the board about my absence. My mother's health emergency took all my focus. I'll make sure to follow the proper procedures from now on." I truly thought that reasonable, diplomatic response would de-escalate the situation, but the cold, self-satisfied smile that spread across Vickie's face told me I'd just made a serious tactical mistake. In her calculating mind, my polite compliance wasn't a gesture of neighborly courtesy, it was a sign of weakness. And as I would soon learn through bitter experience, Vickie Sterling had spent years honing her ability to spot and exploit weakness for her own advantage. As I slowly drove through the winding streets of our usually quiet neighborhood, I couldn't shake the creeping realization that this morning's bizarre encounter had nothing to do with any real rule at all. The entire encounter seemed less about enforcing rules and more about establishing Vickie's absolute dominance over me, someone she clearly saw as a threat to her authority. The professional photographer, The mobile printing station, the dramatic presentation of those official-looking documents, it was all like a carefully staged performance, meant to intimidate and humiliate rather than resolve any actual community concerns. But the most unsettling part came as I was driving back to my house. With a chillingly calm voice and that unmistakable glimmer of anticipation in her eyes, Vickie said, "This is just the beginning, Mr. Harrington." In that moment, her predatory smile and those cold words made it unmistakably clear that my 10-day absence had somehow made me her primary target. What I didn't yet know but would piece together over the next few weeks was that during those same 10 days while I was at the hospital, Vickie Sterling had been busy laying the groundwork for what she saw as my inevitable downfall. She had called multiple emergency board meetings while I was away, rammed through new regulations specifically crafted to target my situation, and set the stage for what she believed would be a swift and decisive victory in her personal war to crush any perceived challenge to her authority. In her mind, I was just another obstacle to be methodically cleared away, another disruption to be erased from her perfectly curated suburban kingdom. But there was one crucial fact that Vickie Sterling didn't know about me. While I might prefer diplomacy and calm resolutions, if someone threatens what matters to me most, I don't just push back, I rewrite the entire game in my favor. The next 3 weeks were a never-ending parade of petty harassment. My poor mailbox became what I could only describe as Vickie's personal violation delivery hub, operating with all the precision of a well-oiled machine designed to wear me down. Like clockwork, every other day brought a new violation notice, each more absurd and petty than the last. First came the infamous mailbox polish violation, where she claimed our brass mailboxes needed weekly polishing under some obscure clause of the community's aesthetic standards. Apparently, mine hadn't been polished for 72 hours. And she had photos time-stamped and taken from multiple angles to prove it. Then there was what she dramatically dubbed the garage door incident, where my crime was leaving my garage door open for 31 minutes while I sorted through my mother's belongings to take to her rehabilitation facility. According to Vickie, this violated the new 30-minute open door policy that had been sneakily created while I was at the hospital and applied retroactively to my situation. But the absolute peak of this madness was the lawnmower noise violation. I had started mowing my lawn at exactly 8:01 am, just 1 minute after the official start time designated by the HOA. But Vickie claimed that her advanced noise monitoring system had picked up what she called engine ignition preparation sounds at 7:58 am. In her warped interpretation of the rules, simply starting the mower engine, regardless of whether anyone was disturbed or not, counted as a violation. Each violation came complete with professional-grade photos, precise timestamps, decibel ratings, enough documentation to hold up in federal court. It seemed. That's when Diane Peterson entered the scene, like a breath of fresh air. She showed up at my front door one evening with a warm casserole in her arms and a look of genuine sympathy. "I've been watching what Vickie's been doing to you," she said as she settled into my kitchen, speaking with a familiarity that made it feel like we were old friends. The woman completely lost it after her real estate empire collapsed a few years back. Now she treats this HOA presidency like she's the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, not a small neighborhood board. Diane had that polished suburban look, perfectly styled blonde hair, flawless nails, and expensive workout clothes that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. As she carefully picked at her nails, she continued, "The trick with dealing with Vickie is understanding how she operates. It's all about power games and psychological manipulation. She's testing you, seeing how much nonsense you'll put up with before you finally decide to stand up to her." She spoke with an air of quiet confidence, and I found myself grateful to have someone who seemed to understand not just Vickie's personality, but the neighborhood's dynamics as a whole. Diane claimed she'd lived in Willowbrook for 8 years and knew everyone's secrets and past conflicts. My first official home meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, and I approached it with what I believed was a level-headed and diplomatic mindset. I'd spent hours preparing talking points about fair accommodations for family emergencies, hoping to bring some sanity back to this HOA circus. Medical emergencies. I had even drafted proposals to amend the community rules, aiming to make them more compassionate and practical for residents dealing with unexpected life challenges. I truly believed that open dialogue, good faith negotiations, and rational compromise would be enough to bridge our differences and find solutions that benefited everyone. Looking back now, I realize how naive and maybe even downright foolish that assumption truly was. The meeting took place at the community center, which Vickie had somehow transformed into her personal courtroom. Presiding over it like a stern judge, she sat at the head of the long conference table, flanked by her loyal board members who lent an air of intimidation to the entire scene. Around 40 residents filled the rows of folding chairs, and I couldn't help but notice that several of them pointedly avoided my gaze, like I was carrying some contagious disease. Vickie had clearly used the time during my absence to spin her own narrative, casting me as the villain of her story. "Before we begin tonight's official agenda," Vickie declared, her voice calm and authoritative, "I believe it's critical to address the ongoing and escalating compliance issues with one particular resident who seems to think the rules don't apply to him." She opened a massive binder with theatrical flair, treating it like some legal tome, and began reading from what she called my comprehensive violation record. 17 painstakingly documented pages cataloged every supposed misdeed in just 3 short weeks. Each alleged violation was read aloud with prosecutorial precision, complete with exact timestamps, photographic evidence, and dramatic descriptions of how my crimes threatened the cherished community standards that everyone else apparently managed to uphold without issue. The public shaming was calculated, thorough, and seemed designed to strip me of any dignity I might have left. By the time she was done, I didn't feel like someone who had been dealing with a family medical emergency. I felt like a career criminal. This is where I made my first big tactical mistake, one that would haunt me for weeks. Instead of calmly acknowledging the criticisms and offering a sincere apology for any disruption I'd caused, I chose to fight back with legal arguments and technical points. I questioned the legitimacy of rules that had been passed without proper notice to the residents they affected, challenged the legality of applying penalties retroactively, and highlighted multiple procedural violations in the way these notices had been issued and documented. In a real courtroom, my carefully researched defense would have been rock solid, but in the court of public opinion, especially in this tight-knit community, it was a complete disaster. To the residents watching this unfold, I didn't sound like someone trying to stand up for fairness. I sounded like an arrogant newcomer who thought he was smarter than everyone else and could talk his way out of following the same rules the rest of them did. Vickie had masterfully manipulated the situation so that my legalistic arguments only made me look like the entitled problem she had been painting me as. By the end of the meeting, several longtime residents openly praised her firm leadership and suggested that maybe I would be happier in a neighborhood with fewer rules. Driving home that night, feeling more alone and defeated than I had in years, I called my mother at the rehab center where she was still recovering from her stroke. Despite her speech being slowed by the brain damage, she managed to give me the best advice I'd heard in weeks. "Pick your battles carefully, son. Some fights just aren't worth winning if they end up costing you everything else that matters." But as I pulled into my driveway, I saw Diane waiting on my porch with a concerned expression and what looked like a bottle of wine in her hand. In that moment, it became crystal clear to me, Vickie Sterling had already chosen this battle for me. The only question left was whether I had the wisdom and strategy to fight it the right way. A few days after that disaster of an home meeting, Vickie unveiled what she dramatically called her nuclear option, complete with the theatrical flourish of a military commander announcing an invasion. She proposed an emergency community assessment of $2,500 per household, supposedly to address urgent drainage issues that, not coincidentally, affected only the section of the neighborhood where I happened to live. The timing was perfect for her. She framed it as an urgent, unavoidable infrastructure need, implying that any delay would cause severe property damage. Of course, these supposed drainage problems had only appeared immediately after our showdown at the meeting, and the costly repairs she proposed just happened to be on properties directly bordering mine. I spent that entire weekend poring over legal resources and whole law precedents, determined to understand the legal basis for this so-called emergency assessment. What I found was both infuriating and begrudgingly impressive. From a tactical perspective, Vickie knew exactly how to play this game. Vickie's actions were obviously questionable from an ethical standpoint and clearly crossed moral lines. Yet, they were technically within her legal authority as HOA president, thanks to the community bylaws. Those governing documents included provisions for emergency infrastructure work, and she had skillfully secured the required board signatures by framing the issue as a pressing safety concern that could lead to serious liability if ignored. It was a masterstroke of psychological and legal maneuvering, expensive enough to put me under intense financial strain, but legally robust enough to survive any challenge I could bring. That's when I made my second critical mistake, a one that almost cost me everything I had worked so hard to build and destroyed any hope of regaining my footing in the community. Rather than pausing to find a more creative or strategic approach, or taking the time to gather broader community support for my position, I chose to escalate things dramatically. I hired a pricey attorney and threatened to sue the HOA for harassment, discrimination, and abuse of process. Given my background and knowledge of governance law, it felt like a reasonable and fair response to Vickie's increasingly aggressive and retaliatory tactics. In reality, though, it was exactly what she had been hoping for and had been carefully maneuvering me into. Within just 24 hours of my attorney sending an official cease and desist letter to the HOA board, Vickie had managed to completely flip the narrative. She wasted no time in calling an emergency community information meeting. There, she branded me as a dangerous community threat. She claimed I was a professional troublemaker who specialized in scamming elderly communities out of their money. Somehow, she'd gotten hold of detailed information about my consulting work and twisted it into a sinister story where I supposedly infiltrated peaceful neighborhoods to create expensive legal problems for personal profit, all at the expense of decent homeowners. The smear campaign was swift, thorough, and brutally effective in ways I couldn't have imagined. Neighbors who had once been polite and neutral started crossing the street to avoid even a brief encounter with me, as though I carried some contagious plague. Mrs. Henderson, who had always waved from her garden with a smile, now glared at me with open hostility, as though I'd personally threatened her grandchildren. The mail carrier stopped bringing packages to my door, leaving them at the curb instead. Even the neighborhood kid who mowed lawns suddenly stopped making eye contact with me and steered clear of my property altogether. But the worst part wasn't the growing social isolation and community shunning. It was the mounting financial pressure that seemed to be closing in from all sides. My mother's medical bills were already pushing my finances to the brink, and her rehab was progressing far slower than the doctors had initially promised. Now I was also staring down huge legal fees and that sudden emergency assessment that I had no means to pay. For the first time in my adult life, I had a complete panic attack. Sitting in my car outside the rehab center after a particularly rough visit with my mother, I couldn't catch my breath. My hands shook uncontrollably. It felt like the world was collapsing around me, and there was no way out. That evening, as if she had a sixth sense for my state of mind, Diane showed up at my door again. This time she brought an expensive bottle of wine and a box of tissues, like she was bracing for a meltdown. "I heard about the attorney," she said softly, easing onto my couch with practiced familiarity, like she'd done this sort of comforting for Elliot countless times before. "I think you really need to consider that maybe Vickie has won this round. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is know when to fold and move on to a better place." Her gentle advice that I should think about selling the house and moving to a different neighborhood, it felt like complete surrender, like admitting total defeat. But it also sounded painfully reasonable. The only real option left to me. "You could get a great price for this place," Diane continued, her tone soft but her message increasingly insistent in a way that should have raised red flags. "The market's incredibly strong right now. And honestly, you'd probably be much happier somewhere with more flexible rules and friendlier leadership. This community isn't for everyone, and there's no shame in deciding it's just not the right fit for you." As she spoke, I began to notice just how well she seemed to know my exact financial situation and how oddly eager she was to see me leave Willowbrook Estates. The final straw came at midnight when I found an official-looking eviction notice taped to my front door. like some medieval proclamation of banishment. The document claimed I had violated the community's peaceful enjoyment covenant by making frivolous legal threats against the HOA and its duly elected board. It gave me exactly 30 days to stop all legal action and comply with the community rules or face immediate removal from the property. Standing there in my pajamas under the harsh glare of the porch light, holding that absurd piece of paper, it hit me with absolute clarity. Vickie had successfully maneuvered me into an impossible corner. Fighting back now only made me look unreasonable and vindictive, and she knew it. But choosing not to fight back felt like accepting total defeat and humiliation. For the first time in this whole escalating mess, I seriously considered whether Diane might be right or whether cutting my losses and moving somewhere new might be the only path to peace and a fresh start. The eviction notice was a perfect example of legal theater. Official-looking seals, embossed letterhead, and elaborate citations of community covenant violations that sounded serious but were, in reality, completely meaningless. Vickie was clearly betting that I'd either panic and immediately put my house on the market or escalate the legal fight in a way that would further damage my reputation and solidify her control. What she didn't anticipate was that I'd draw on my years of experience working with dysfunctional organizations. When someone starts deploying fake legal documents and intimidation tactics, the best counter is to meticulously document every move they make and let them trap themselves in their own lies. So for the next 3 days, I dove into researching every aspect of the eviction process. I consulted with multiple legal experts, studied the community's governing documents with the intensity of a law professor, and left no detail unchecked. What I found was both infuriating and oddly reassuring for my long-term outlook. The eviction notice itself was completely invalid. It was riddled with procedural mistakes, unsupported claims, and references to powers that simply didn't exist in the actual bylaws of our community. But beyond that, I realized that Vickie's increasingly aggressive behavior was a clear sign of her growing desperation, not her strength. A leader who truly holds legitimate authority doesn't need to rely on intimidation, fake legal documents, and elaborate charades to stay in control. That's when I made a discovery that completely reframed everything I thought I knew. While reviewing footage from my doorbell camera, I noticed something deeply unsettling about Diane's supposedly friendly visits. During our conversations, she'd been snapping photos of any documents I'd left on the coffee table when I stepped out of the room. She'd been photographing my mail and even recording our private conversations on her phone, all without my knowledge or consent. The one person I had trusted to be on my side had been spying on me the entire time and feeding every detail back to Vickie. I knew confronting Diane would take careful planning. I had to fully understand just how far her betrayal went and gather irrefutable proof before she had a chance to tip Vickie off that her mole had been exposed. So I set a simple but effective trap. I planted fake documents about hiring a private investigator in plain sight on the coffee table before her next visit. Sure enough, less than 6 hours after she left, Vickie called an emergency board meeting to discuss escalating security concerns supposedly coming from a vindictive resident who was plotting to invade the privacy of the entire community. When I finally confronted Diane, armed with video footage and photographic proof, she tried at first to deny everything with the practiced calm of someone who's been lying for years. But when I showed her the recordings of her taking photos and capturing our conversations, her composure crumbled. She broke down in tears and confessed the full extent of Vickie's web of manipulation. Through her sobs, she even promised to write a personal recommendation letter for my daughter's private school application, admitting that Madison had been stuck on the Westminster Academy waiting list for 2 years and that Vickie had connections on the admissions board. "I never imagined this would go so far or hurt you this badly," Diane choked out. But her tearful confession revealed a scheme far bigger than just personal manipulation. According to Diane, Vickie had been systematically targeting so-called non-compliant residents for removal as part of a much larger and more sinister plan. Her goal was to quietly sell off properties in the neighborhood to a development company for enormous personal gain. Over the past 2 years, 3 other families had been forced out using similar harassment and phony violations, with their properties quietly sold to shell companies that were directly tied to Vickie's vast real estate empire. Vickie called it community improvement whenever she spoke about it publicly, Diane explained. her voice trembling with a mix of fear and guilt. But in reality, she was methodically flipping the entire neighborhood for huge personal gain. She had been working in secret with developers who wanted to tear down these older homes and replace them with luxury condosa units that would sell for 3 times what our homes were worth. Each family she managed to force out meant another property for her partners to snap up at below market prices, using intimidation and manufactured crises to make it happen. The scale of the scheme was breathtakingly complicated, audacious, and carried out with complete disregard for the community she claimed to protect. As if on cue, my phone buzzed in the middle of our conversation about her criminal activities. It was an official notification that made my blood run cold. Emergency Community Meeting Friday 7 p.m. Final vote on problem resident actions. Vickie was calling for what she clearly intended to be my public execution, a formal vote to permanently bar me from all community amenities and effectively force me to sell my home under duress. But now, thanks to Diane's confession, I finally understood what I was really up against. This wasn't just a personal feud with a power-hungry HOA president, it was a massive real estate fraud scheme threatening the very soul of our community. The next morning, I discovered that new security cameras had been installed throughout all the shared areas overnight. They were ostensibly for enhanced community safety, but their placement was suspiciously precise, tracking my every move and gathering ammunition for Vickie's next attack. She was tightening her grip, determined to crush me completely, but she didn't know that I had spent the last 4 days quietly building a secret alliance with the other families she had targeted. Together, we were ready to flip the script on her in ways she couldn't even imagine. The irony was almost too good to believe. Via Vickie's own surveillance cameras were about to become the tools of her undoing. The days leading up to that Friday meeting felt like preparation for an all-out war. But this time, I wasn't fighting alone. Through careful and discreet conversations, I had managed to connect with Tom Bradley, a retired physician who had spent months quietly documenting Vickie's financial improprieties. I had also teamed up with the Morrison family, who had been targeted for removal 6 months earlier but had managed to hold their ground through sheer determination and meticulous records. Together, we pieced together a damning portrait of systematic abuse and corruption that went far beyond just my personal battle. It was a pattern of criminal behavior that threatened everyone. Tom's research had uncovered that Vickie had approved more than $80,000 in shady landscaping work with companies owned by her ex-husband. Most of that work was never done at all, or it was wildly overpriced compared to normal rates. Meanwhile, the Morrisons had documented dozens of instances where Vickie's political allies received only gentle warnings for rule breaking, while her targets faced formal violations and financial penalties. But the biggest smoking gun was the pattern of property acquisitions that followed each forced departure, an unmistakable sign of financial gain driving her ruthless campaign. Of course, Vickie hadn't been idle either. She spent the entire week carefully orchestrating the attendance at the upcoming meeting to ensure her victory. Through a cunning mix of scheduling conflicts, intimidation, and misinformation about the meeting's significance, she had whittled down the expected turnout to just 15 residents, 12 of whom she counted as loyal allies who would vote however she instructed them. It was a masterclass in small-scale political manipulation, and under any other circumstances, it would have been enough to guarantee her success in driving me out. My plan was risky but elegantly straightforward. I would record the entire meeting and challenge its legality on the spot. By doing so, I would force Vickie to either follow proper procedure or expose herself as operating far beyond any legitimate authority. I had spent hours consulting with my attorney about Georgia's recording laws and confirmed that as long as one party consented, which in this case was me, the recording would be fully legal and admissible in any future legal action against Vickie and the HOA. The meeting itself was pure political theater, Vickie's attempt to intimidate and humiliate me in front of the entire community. She had set the room up like a courtroom, seating herself at the head table like a Supreme Court judge while I sat alone, the accused, facing the residents like a defendant awaiting sentencing. Vickie opened with a 20-minute presentation, complete with professional slides and glossy handouts that painted me as a habitual troublemaker, a serial offender rather than someone who'd been harassed during a family health crisis. When the formal vote finally took place, it played out. Hyde doesn't need to rig votes, fabricate legal documents, or set up elaborate surveillance systems to maintain control. Vickie Sterling was terrified of something, and I was going to find out exactly what it was. The next morning, I made a phone call that would change everything. Detective Chen, this is Elliot Harrington. I'd like to report possible embezzlement and fraud in a homeowners association. Detective Sarah Chen arrived at my house Monday morning. She had that calm, careful skepticism of someone who'd spent years investigating white-collar crime and dealing with residents who thought every HOA dispute was a federal case. "Mr. Harrington," she said, settling into my living room with her notepad and a large coffee, "I need to be honest, most HOA complaints are just personality conflicts, not actual crimes. What makes you think this is something more serious?" That's when I showed her 3 months' worth of meticulously organized evidence, Tom's detailed financial records, the Morrison family's systematic documentation of selective enforcement, photos of the incomplete landscaping projects that had drained community funds, and most importantly a Diane-signed statement describing Vickie's bribery efforts and her confession about the property acquisition scheme. What had looked like a personal feud suddenly took on the shape of a sophisticated fraud operation of multiple victims, substantial sums of money, and a clear financial motive. Detective Chen's demeanor changed instantly. She began photographing documents, taking careful notes, and analyzing the patterns we'd uncovered. "This is much more systematic and organized than typical HOA corruption cases," she admitted. "The property acquisition pattern alone might have interstate commerce implications. If that's the case, this could even become a federal investigation. But to build a truly airtight case," she said, "we needed direct evidence, documentary proof or recordings of criminal intent." That's when it hit me. Vickie's own security cameras might hold the key to her undoing. With Detective Chen's help and a court-approved warrant, we gained access to review the security footage. What we found surpassed even our highest expectations. In one particularly damning video, which would later become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, Vickie was on the phone saying, "The Harrington situation is moving faster than expected. Once he's gone, that's another property we can acquire below market. My contacts at Sterling Development are ready to move in as soon as we clear the last few obstacles." She went on to list dollar figures, detailed timelines, and explicit instructions for creating fake violations and harassment campaigns, leaving absolutely no doubt about her criminal intentions. But the final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Detective Chen's forensic accounting work uncovered that Vickie had been using HOA funds to pay her personal legal fees, credit card bills, and even her daughter's tuition at an expensive private college. The paper trail was extensive and sloppily hidden, a proof that Vickie had grown careless and arrogant as her scheme expanded. Vickie thought she was untouchable. In the end, she had siphoned off more than $120,000 from community funds over the past 3 years, some money that should have gone to real improvements and maintenance. Once word of the criminal investigation started circulating, Vickie's carefully built network of supporters began to crumble like a house of cards in a gale. Residents who had backed her out of fear, confusion, or personal gain finally started sharing their own stories of intimidation and manipulation. The Morrison family came forward, revealing how Vickie had threatened to have their teenage son arrested for criminal trespassing after he used the community pool during so-called restricted hours, a rule she'd invented just to target them. Diane's confession turned out to be the tipping point. After that, several other residents admitted they'd been pressured to back Vickie through bribes, threats, or promises of special treatment. Mrs. Patterson shared how Vickie had promised to overlook her garden gnome violation, which technically broke community aesthetics rules, in exchange for her unwavering support. Mr. Williams finally admitted he'd voted against his own conscience because Vickie threatened to report his legitimate home-based business to county officials, who could have shut it down. The community that had seemed so united against me days earlier turned out to be a group of neighbors who had been intimidated and manipulated into silence, too afraid, too isolated, or too compromised to resist Vickie's authoritarian control. Detective Chen told me that this kind of coercion was classic behavior for white-collar criminals. They create an atmosphere of fear and compliance to keep people from speaking out. As she prepared the arrest warrant with the district attorney's office, Detective Chen warned me that Vickie would probably become more desperate and unpredictable once she realized the investigation was closing in. White-collar criminals always think one more aggressive move will fix everything and make the evidence disappear, she explained. Be ready for her to try something big and maybe even dangerous. Detective Chen's warning proved chillingly accurate. That evening, I came home to find Vickie waiting at the community gate, flanked by 2 private security guards, clearly preparing for what she saw as her final showdown. The irony was impossible to miss. She was about to doom herself with her own actions, and I was ready to document every second of it for the criminal trial that was sure to follow. Tuesday morning brought exactly the kind of dramatic showdown Vickie Sterling had been angling for all along, except this time, she had no idea Detective Chen was parked just around the corner in an unmarked vehicle, watching everything in real time through the same security cameras Vickie had installed to spy on the rest of us. I approached the main gate at exactly 7:30 a.m., fully aware that Vickie would be waiting with whatever final power play she had in mind. Sure enough, there she was standing at the entrance with her 2 imposing guards beside her, as if she were guarding a military base instead of a suburban neighborhood. "Mr. Harrington," she called out, loud enough for the small group of curious neighbors to hear, "you are permanently and irrevocably banned from these premises. Any attempt to enter will result in immediate arrest for criminal trespassing and violation of community standards." She'd obviously rehearsed her speech. Her voice had that theatrical, self-assured rhythm of someone who truly believed she was closing this chapter for good. But I kept my response calm and measured, pulling out my phone to record the whole exchange. "Mrs. Sterling," I said, steady as I could, "I'm a property owner here. I have full legal rights to my home and the common areas. Unless you have a valid court order or some other legitimate legal authority, you cannot keep me from entering my own neighborhood." I wanted to sound calm and reasonably, especially compared to her increasingly unhinged ranting. And then Vickie made the mistake that would end up destroying her case entirely. In her desperation to hold on to power, she began ranting about her absolute authority as HOA president, insisting she had the legal responsibility to protect the community from troublemakers and criminals. But even more damning for the prosecution's case, she started openly admitting to using community funds for personal legal expenses and for targeting me. "I've used community funds to deal with direct threats like you," she snapped. "Every dollar was spent to keep this community safe and protect property values from people like you who are trying to tear it down." That was the moment Detective Chen stepped forward. "Mrs. Sterling," she said, calm and authoritative, "I'm Detective Chen with the County Police Department. I need to talk to you about some serious financial discrepancies we've uncovered in the HOA accounts." The timing was perfect. It was almost cinematic in its perfection. The look of shock and panic that swept across Vickie's face was worth every single moment of harassment and humiliation I'd suffered during those 3 chaotic months. What followed was a complete psychological collapse that laid bare the full extent of Vickie's delusions and how disconnected she'd become from reality. "You can't do this to me," she screamed at Detective Chen, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering. "I built this community from nothing. I protected these people from criminals and riffraff." She gestured at me with pure hatred, as if I were some sort of existential threat instead of a homeowner who'd spent months quietly caring for his sick mother. The irony reached its perfect peak when Detective Chen calmly informed her she was under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty right in front of the very security cameras she'd used to monitor and intimidate us all. As Detective Chen read her Miranda rights, Vickie ranted on, her voice growing wilder even as the handcuffs clicked shut, providing a final stream of evidence for the prosecution. She was still demanding to know who had betrayed her and destroyed everything as she was led away in cuffs. In that moment, the watching residents finally understood the full scope of what had been happening in their community all along. Tom Bradley didn't waste any time. He immediately called for an emergency home meeting to strip Vickie of every official position and start the long process of cleaning up the mess. The fallout was swift, thorough, and more satisfying than I ever could have hoped. Within a week, Vickie had been unanimously removed from all HOA roles, and Tom was elected interim president with the clear mandate to restore honesty, accountability, and basic decency to our community. Diane Peterson publicly apologized to every media, including me, exposing the depth of Vickie's manipulations and agreeing to serve as a key witness in the criminal case. Financial recovery took longer, but ultimately Vickie was ordered to pay back $137,000 in stolen funds, plus significant penalties and interest that would haunt her for years. 3 months later, she was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison and 5 years of probation. The judge declared that her systematic abuse of authority and targeting of residents was a particularly egregious betrayal of trust that demanded serious consequences. 6 months after all this began, I received a handwritten note from new neighbors thanking me for standing up and restoring Willowbrook Estates to the welcoming community they'd hoped to find. My mother had recovered enough to move into a wonderful assisted living facility, where she loved telling the other residents how her son had taken down the neighborhood tyrant. Most rewarding of all, our community implemented thorough new governance rules to ensure no future Vickie Sterling could ever turn our neighborhood into their personal kingdom again. In the end, I realized the best revenge wasn't some dramatic schmea. It was simply watching her undo herself with her own arrogance and greed, while we rebuilt something better and stronger in her wake. If there's one lesson to take away from this, it's that the most powerful thing you can do when you're up against a bully is to stay calm, document everything, and let them trip over their own lies. And if you're ever stuck with a power-hungry HOA president, remember this: patience, persistence, and a thorough record will always outlast intimidation and fear. Sooner or later, every tyrant makes the mistake that finally brings them down. And when they do, justice is the sweetest reward of all. Thanks for watching Ya Story Essa, where common sense goes on vacation and karma hosts the show. Like, comment, and subscribe for your weekly fix of mayhem and poetic justice.